Chapter 25, The Sixties, 1960 to 1968, Part 5. The rise of a white youth student movement was a surprise to many. Colleges had long been conservative institutions that drew their students from the privileged strata in American society, and few thought college students in the 1960s had anything to complain about. But student definitions of freedom, as they took form in a critique of mainstream values and institutions, birthed a protest movement that came to be called the New Left. What made the New Left new was its rejection of the political and intellectual categories that shaped radicalism and liberalism for most of the 20th century. It challenged mainstream America and the old left of the 1930s and 40s. Unlike the Communist Party, it did not see the Soviet Union as a model society or view the working class as the main agent of social change. Not language of economic equality and social citizenship, but the language of loneliness, isolation, alienation, and powerlessness in a bureaucratic society whose affluence denied authenticity characterized New Left expression. The baby boom produced a mass generation influenced by these ideas, as more than 7 million attended college by 1968. The New Left ultimately had roots in the American Revolution and the critique made by the abolitionists of the gap between American values and realities. It was inspired by the cultural radicalisms of the 1910s and 1950s, but its most immediate inspiration was the Black Freedom Movement. The 60s, a decade of political, racial, and cultural turmoil, was born of claims made by those who felt excluded from society, from Southern and urban blacks to middle-class students. Both the Black movement and the New White Left shared the belief that the evils were deeply embedded in America's institutions and could only be resolved through direct confrontation. In 1962 and 1963, books appeared that challenged the 1950s consensus. James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time captured the anger of blacks. Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring showed the environmental costs of economic growth, and Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities criticized the urban renewal and highway construction that made cities larger and less diverse, and thus less livable and socially interactive. But in some ways, the most influential critique came in 1962 from a small group of liberal and radical college students, Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. Their Port Huron statement, composed at Port Huron, Michigan, criticized American institutions, including political parties, corporations, unions, and the military-industrial complex. But the document inspired new student radicalism with its vision of social change. The statement's authors called for the creation of a democracy of individual participation, where the individual shares in those social decisions determining the quality and direction of his life. Freedom, for the New Left, meant participatory democracy. This rather vague standard was used to judge existing social arrangements. Workplaces, schools, and government were found to be deeply flawed and undemocratic. The New Left rejected a society run by experts, the dream of the progressive generation. SDS grew quickly, and in 1964, events at the University of California at Berkeley revealed the power of the student movement. This university, an immense and bureaucratic Cold War institution, imposed a new rule that banned political groups from using a central area of the campus to distribute ideas and literature. It sparked massive protests. Students, including conservatives, created a movement for free expression. Protest leaders linked the university to a knowledge factory and encouraged students to break the machines. Massive protests for months caused the university to rescind its ban on free expression. The Vietnam War transformed Black and New Left protest into a generational rebellion. The war, a logical extension of the Cold War assumptions and policies, demonstrated the danger of treating the world and every local situation through a simple anti-communist lens. Few Americans, even policymakers deciding to go to war, knew much at all about Vietnam's history or culture. Cold War administrations viewed a complex national liberation struggle led by homegrown communists who had broad popular support and Soviets' backing as a test of containment. The Truman and Eisenhower administration had supported France's failed efforts to retain Vietnam as a colony, but then cast their lot with the South Vietnamese government in violation of Geneva Accords that had promised elections to unify North and South Vietnam. By the 1960s, the United States supported Ngo Dinh Diem's brutal and corrupt regime in the South. Fears that voters would not forgive them if they lost Vietnam made Kennedy and Johnson reluctant to remove U.S. aid and forces from Vietnam. Kennedy's advisors saw Vietnam as a test of whether the U.S. could successfully conduct counterinsurgencies, interventions against internal uprisings in non-communist countries, in order to stop Third World revolutions. But U.S. advisors in Vietnam Aiding Diem's government could not check the progress of communist-led Viet Cong insurgency, and in October 1963, after large Buddhist protests against Diem's regime, the United States approved a military coup that led to Diem's death. Lyndon Johnson took office with little experience in foreign relations. While reluctant to send U.S. troops to South Vietnam and fearing interminable involvement, he felt that losing Vietnam would deliver electoral advantages to Republicans. In August of 1964, North Vietnamese boats encountered an American ship on a spy mission off the North Vietnam's coast. When the boats fired on the U.S. vessel, Johnson claimed the United States was a victim of aggression. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution authorizing the President to take measures to defend U.S. forces in Vietnam. Only 2 senators voted against the resolution. The nearest the United States came to declaring war in this conflict, and it passed without any discussion of U.S. goals or strategy. In 2005, the National Security Agency released secret documents which made clear that no North Vietnamese attack ever occurred. In the 1964 election campaign, Johnson said he did not intend to send U.S. troops to Vietnam. Advised to do so after the proper provocation, he launched airstrikes against North Vietnam and sent U.S. ground troops to the south when the Viet Cong in early 1965 attacked a U.S. air base. By 1968, more than 500,000 U.S. troops were at war in South Vietnam. U.S. forces bombed North and South Vietnam with more tonnage than was used by all sides in World War II. U.S. ground forces ruthlessly hunted the Viet Cong in search and destroy operations that left villages burned and many civilians killed. But the might of the U.S. military did not break the Viet Cong insurgency or its North Vietnamese support. Simultaneously, Johnson sent U.S. troops to the Dominican Republic, where military leaders tried to restore the rule of Juan Bosch, the left-wing but non-communist president who in 1963 had been removed from power by a military coup. Johnson dispatched troops to quell unrest and ensure that Bosch would not return. With rising casualties and the massive bombing of North and South Vietnam, the Cold War consensus began to disintegrate. By 1968, the war had sidetracked much of the Great Society and divided families, universities, and the Democratic Party. With both liberal and conservative political leaders committed to the war, young activists lost all confidence in the political system. Opposition to the war united all kinds of grievances and discontent with American society. With college students exempted from the draft, the fighting of the war fell to working class and poor draftees. In 1967, even Martin Luther King Jr., a one-time ally of President Johnson, condemned the war for its violence and its diversion of resources from America. To SDS, the war seemed to epitomize the antithesis of participatory democracy, since U.S. intervention had risen from secret commitments and decisions made by political elites with no real debate. SDS organized the first major anti-war demonstration, which occurred in Washington, D.C. in April of 1965, and from there protests spread across the country. By 1967, young men were burning their draft cards and fleeing to Canada to avoid fighting what they believed to be an unjust war. In October of 1967, as many as 100,000 anti-war protesters converged on the Pentagon. During the 1960s, Americans' definition of freedom grew to include cultural freedom. The war was a central cause of the generational rebellion called the Counterculture. By the late 1960s, millions of young people rejected their elders' values and behavior. Their ranks included not just college students, but young workers, even though most unions strongly condemned anti-war protests and counterculture. For the first time in American history, the repudiation of respectable norms in clothing, language, sexual behavior, and drug use became the foundations of a mass movement. Much of the counterculture, such as colorful clothes, rock music, and images of sexual freedom, were easily turned into mass-marketed goods, even though ostensibly they represented a rejection of mass consumer culture. But self-indulgence and destruction were built into the counterculture. Counterculture icons like Timothy Leary urged young people to take hallucinogenic drugs like LSD and turn on, tune in, and drop out. Yet the counterculture was more than just sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Personal liberation represented a rebellion against and release from bureaucratized education and work, repressive behavioral norms, and a militarized state that wreaked destruction on distant lands. It encouraged new forms of radical action. Underground newspapers pioneered a highly personal and political journalism. The Youth International Party, or Yippies, injected human and spectacle into the protest. In one instance, throwing dollar bills from the visitors' gallery onto the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, halting trade as brokers scrambled to grab the money. The counterculture established havens in cities like New York in the East Village and San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury. 2,000 communes were established in rural areas throughout the nation. The Woodstock Music Festival in upstate New York in 1969 brought hundreds of thousands of young people together who were welcomed with the first song by Richie Havens, who began it by repeating a single word: freedom. Above all, the counterculture centered on the free individual nowhere more so than in sexual freedom. The birth control pill had separated sex from reproduction and allowed free love to flourish. The sexual revolution also contributed to the birth of the second wave of feminism in the late 1960s. The civil rights movement had inspired other Americans to express their grievances and claim rights. Many borrowed the militant tactics of blacks and students and adopted their language of power and liberation, rejecting traditional organizations and approaches. Part 6. Women's suffrage had not ended women's lack of power and opportunity. When the 1960s began, only a few women held political office. Women were still restricted to traditionally female occupations, and major universities limited the number of women admitted. But a new feminist consciousness began to emerge in 1963 with the publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique. Friedan criticized the emptiness of consumer culture and emphasized middle-class discontent. Her book portrayed talented and educated young women trapped in a world which they believed marriage and motherhood were the primary ambitions. Women's lives still revolved around the home, now a suburban home, which Friedan called a comfortable concentration camp. The book focused attention on feminist concerns. In 1963, Congress passed the Equal Pay Act, barring sex discrimination among those holding the same job. The Civil Rights Act prohibited inequalities based on sex as well as race. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission challenged barriers to women's employment. In 1966, the National Organization of Women was formed, with Friedan the president as a civil rights organization to press for equal opportunity in jobs, education, and political participation. A more militant feminist movement emerged from the civil rights and student movements. Young women who embraced ideologies of equality and freedom and learned political organizing skills, once facing inequality and sexual exploitation within these movements, formed their own. Some white women in civil rights work drew parallels between the treatment of blacks and women. In SDS, women protested their subordination and exploitation by male activists. By 1967, women were forming consciousness-raising groups to discuss their cause of discontent. The movement began sensationally at the Miss America beauty pageant in Atlantic City in 1968, where women threw into a trash can, but did not burn, bras, high-heeled shoes, and copies of Playboy and Cosmopolitan. The women's liberation movement greatly expanded the idea of freedom by insisting it should be applied to the most personal and intimate parts of life. These feminists, introducing terms like sexism, sexual politics, and the phrase, "the personal is political," argued that sexual relations, marriage, and beauty standards were just as political as war, civil rights, and class tensions. This repudiated the sacred nuclear family of the 1950s and permanently changed Americans' definition of freedom. Radical feminists first campaigned for the repeal of state laws that denied women the right to terminate the pregnancy. They defined control over reproduction as the most basic of women's freedoms, but women liberation's concerns went far beyond sexual freedom. Interest ranged from combating domestic violence to inequalities in the law, churches, workplaces, and family. By 1970, feminist ideas were penetrating mainstream American life. Perhaps the greatest surprise of the 1960s was the movement for gay liberation. Gays and lesbians had formed societies in the 1950s, but these were not protest groups. Homosexuals faced stigmatization as sinful or mentally ill. Most states made homosexual acts illegal, and police harassed gays in major cities like San Francisco and New York. Most gays and lesbians kept their sexuality in the closet. The 1960s transformed gay politics. One moment in particular marks the beginning of gay liberation. The 1969 riot caused by a police raid on the Stonewall Bar in New York's Greenwich Village. Instead of complying with police as usual, gays fought back. In a few years, gay pride marches were being held in cities across the country. In the mid-1960s, a new movement emerged among Mexican Americans that challenged their status as second-class citizens. Like Black Power, this movement emphasized pride in the Mexican past and the Chicano culture born in the United States. But unlike SDS and Black Power, Latino activism was tied to labor struggles. In 1965, Cesar Chavez, the son of a migrant farm worker and disciple of Martin Luther King Jr., led nonviolent protests to force growers to sign labor contracts with the United Farm Workers Union, or the UFW. the UFW campaign mobilized Latinos for civil and economic rights across the Southwest, and by 1970, the major growers had signed contracts with the Union. In New York, the Young Lords, modeled after the Black Panthers, held street demonstrations to protest conditions facing Puerto Ricans. Like SDS and SNCC, the Latino movement, with its male leaders and emphasis on machismo, inspired protests by women who called for freedom and equality for all members of La Raza, or the race, or the people. Indian militancy also emerged in the 1960s. Although the Truman and Eisenhower administrations had tried to dismantle reservations and integrate Indians into mainstream American life, many Indian leaders protested, and these efforts were abandoned by President Kennedy. President Johnson's programs gave some funds to reservations, but Indian activists compared the reservations to underdeveloped nations, and they demanded not just economic aid, but also self-determination. The American Indian Movement, founded in 1968, staged protests demanding greater tribal sovereignty and economic resources guaranteed in treaties. In 1969, Indians seized Alcatraz Island in San Francisco, claiming it had been illegally seized from the original inhabitants. The protest, lasting until 1971, inspired the Red Power movement. In the 1970s and 80s, many Indian tribes won more control over education and economic development on reservations, and Indian activists brought land claims and other suits demanding compensation for past dispossession. The environmental movement challenged foundations of American life, including assumptions that progress meant endless growth and consumption, and the faith that science, technology, and economic growth improved social welfare. The Progressive era saw the beginnings of conservation in public parks, but the new environmental movement was militant, demanding that individuals have control over decisions that affected them. The affluence and mass consumption of the 1950s and early 60s was now identified as the source of environmental degradation. In 1962, Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, exposed to millions of Americans the effects of DDT, an insecticide used by homeowners and farmers against mosquitoes and other insects. Carson showed how DDT killed birds and animals and sickened humans. Chemical and pesticide companies tried to discredit her as a communist or hysterical, but her work inspired the modern environmental movement. The membership of the Sierra Club, founded in the 1890s to preserve forests, skyrocketed, and soon groups across the country were exposing the dangers of water contamination, air pollution, and extinct species. Nearly every state quickly banned DDT. In 1969, a major oil spill on the California coast revealed the costs and risks of oil drilling and transportation. Despite opposition from business groups which saw environmentalism as an infringement on property rights, the movement enjoyed broad support. Under Republican President Richard Nixon, Congress passed a series of measures to protect the environment, including the Clean Air, Clean Water, and Endangered Species Act. In April 1970, the first Earth Day drew the participation of 20 million people. The consumer movement, a close cousin to environmentalism, also flourished. It was inspired by Ralph Nader, whose book, Unsafe at Any Speed, in 1965, showed how auto manufacturers produced highly dangerous vehicles. General Motors hired private investigators to try to discredit him, and when their efforts were exposed, GM paid Nader a large settlement, which he used to fund investigations of other dangerous consumer products and false advertising. Nader's work laid the foundation for numerous state and federal laws for consumer safety, which limited one kind of freedom, especially private property rights, in the name of a greater good. Although the rights revolution began in the streets, it won constitutional legitimacy in the Supreme Court, traditionally the most conservative government branch. Guided by Chief Justice Earl Warren, the court greatly expanded the rights of all Americans and placed them beyond the reach of legislative and local majorities. The court's move towards protecting civil liberties and rights began in the 1930s, but was signaled in 1957 when the court started to check McCarthyism by overturning the convictions of individuals who had advocated overthrowing the government, not answered questions of the House of Un-American Activities Committee, or refused to state their political beliefs to state officials. By 1969, the court had affirmed the right to uphold unpopular views and dismantled the Cold War loyalty security system. In the 1950s and 1960s, civil liberties became integrated with civil rights. The court protected the rights of private organizations to keep secret their membership lists and secured modern freedom of the press. In the 1960s, the court continued to strike down numerous state segregation laws. In Loving v. Virginia in 1967, the court declared unconstitutional state laws that prohibited interracial marriage. The court in 1968 made illegal racial discrimination in the rental or sale of housing. The court also pressed states to respect civil liberties enshrined in the Bill of Rights. It required states to abide by protections against illegal search and seizure, honor defendants' rights to a speedy trial, prohibit cruel and unusual punishments, and secure the right of poor defendants to receive publicly supported counsel. Miranda v. Arizona in 1966 was one of the most important of these decisions, in which individuals were supposed to be made aware of their rights upon arrest, including their right to remain silent and confer with lawyers before answering any questions. The Warren Court also outlined entirely new rights in response to changes in American society. Most dramatically, it invented a constitutional right to privacy in Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965, overturning a state law banning the use of contraceptives. Although the Constitution nowhere articulates a right of privacy, Justice William O. Douglas, the author of the decision, asserted that privacy was the basis of all other freedoms and that a constitutionally protected area of privacy within marriage could be inferred from the shadows of the Bill of Rights. The court soon made privacy a right of individuals within or outside of marriage by ensuring access to birth control and, most controversially, by creating a constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy in Roe v. Wade in 1973, a major victory of feminist movement and the source of a major opposition still to this day. The rulings that followed Griswold and Roe seemed to accept the view that families were collections of individuals rather than a unit with a single authority. Women gained multiple rights within the family, including protection against rape and assault by husbands. The 1960s climaxed in 1968 when profound events happened so quickly that society seemed to be disintegrating. In January of 1968, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, multiple uprisings throughout South Vietnam that took major cities and completely surprised U.S. military leaders. U.S. forces repulsed the attacks and inflicted heavy losses, but the intense fighting, captured on TV, eroded the confidence of the public and political and military leaders who repeatedly claimed that victory was not far off. Leading figures in politics and the press now criticized the war. Eugene McCarthy, an anti-war senator from Minnesota, announced he would seek the Democratic presidential nomination, and with the support of thousands of students, won the New Hampshire primary. Lyndon Johnson, stunned, refused to send 200,000 more troops to Vietnam, as the Army suggested, and declared he would not seek re-election. Peace talks began in Paris. Martin Luther King Jr. at the time was organizing a Poor People's March on Washington to demand more federal anti-poverty programs. But after traveling to Memphis to support a strike by black sanitation workers there, King was killed by a white assassin. The greatest outbreak of urban violence in American history soon erupted. Washington, D.C. was occupied by soldiers before order was restored. At the end of April, students protesting Columbia University's participation in defense research and its plan to build a gymnasium in a public park occupied campus buildings and were forcibly removed by police. In June, a young Palestinian nationalist assassinated Robert F. Kennedy, who was seeking the Democratic nomination as an anti-war candidate. In August, tens of thousands of anti-war demonstrators went to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago to protest the nomination of Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and Chicago's police wildly attacked the demonstrators. The government indicted 8 radicals for conspiring to incite the violence, and after a tumultuous trial of the Chicago's 8, several were found guilty. Their charges were overturned on appeal, given the flagrant bias of the judge. Part 7. The year 1968 was one of worldwide turmoil. In many nations, young radicals confronted power structures, borrowing language and strategies from America's protest movements and adapting them to their own circumstances. Television carried images of protests to other countries simultaneously. Massive anti-war protests happened in London, Rome, Paris, Munich, and Tokyo, with great violence. In Italy, students occupied universities. In Paris, a nationwide student uprising that began in May of 1968 echoed American students' demands, but in France, millions of French workers went on strike, demanding higher wages and workplace democracy. A general strike resulted, which nearly toppled the government. In communist Czechoslovakia, reformist leaders trying to democratize socialism were ousted by a Soviet invasion. Troops fired on students demonstrating for greater democracy at the Olympics in Mexico City, killing more than 500. In Northern Ireland, still part of Great Britain after Ireland achieved independence, the police attacked a non-violent march demanding an end to religious discrimination, initiating an era of violence called the Troubles. Throughout the world, American second-wave feminism inspired women of other nations to protest for equal rights and citizenship. Women in Catholic nations, such as France and Italy, won the right to obtain divorce and have abortions. Our Bodies, Ourselves, a book published by Boston women dealing with widely misunderstood women's health issues such as pregnancy and childbirth, menopause, and birth control, was translated into over 20 languages. Though 1968 was a year of radical protest, the year marked a conservative reaction as well. Social protests sparked calls for law and order. Black militancy provoked white backlash, a growing force in politics, and the Supreme Court's invention and protection of rights led to claims that distant federal bureaucrats were meddling with local tradition. In August, Richard Nixon made a striking political comeback by winning the Republican presidential nomination. He campaigned as champion of the silent majority, ordinary Americans who believed change had gone too far and called for law and order. Facing a divided Democratic Party, Nixon barely won a victory over Hubert Humphrey. Yet George Wallace, running as an independent on a platform of resentment against civil rights, the Great Society, and the Warren Court, received 13% of the national vote. The Nixon and Wallace totals taken together showed that liberalism was in retreat. But 1968 did not mark the end of the 60s. The Great Society actually peaked under Nixon, and second-wave feminism surged into the 1970s. But Nixon's election initiated a period of conservatism in American politics. The 1960s did not produce a revolution, but it did revolutionize American life. It produced new rights and understandings of freedom. It allowed racial minorities to enter mainstream American life, although it did not solve urban poverty. It started to transform women's status. It made Americans expect new things from government like clean air and old age medical insurance, but it also undermined public confidence in political leaders. Relations between the generations and between whites and non-whites, along with every institution in society, changed. The debates of the 1960s would live on in later questions and controversies, and as the nation became more conservative, the 1960s became blamed for many social ills. However, the United States became more open, more tolerant, and more free in this decade.